My hands were submerged in dishwater when I heard my stepmother's laugh drift through the kitchen window. That particular crystalline trill she reserved for impressing strangers. Through the glass, I could see her moving among her guests on the brick patio, gesturing toward the greenhouse with one manicured hand while the other cradled a wine glass. The afternoon sun caught the condensation on the glass, turning it into something precious. Beyond her, a dozen well-dressed people nodded and smiled, their attention fixed on her like she was conducting an orchestra. I scrubbed harder at the casserole dish in my hands, watching the suds cloud the water until I couldn't see my own fingers anymore. My father had married Johnny Farlow 3 years ago, 18 months after my mother died. I was 42 then, stationed overseas, and I'd received the news via a brief email. Dad's getting remarried. Woman named Johnny, seems nice. Wedding in 2 weeks. I'd sent my regrets, couldn't get leave, and a crystal vase from a department store website. When I finally met her 6 months later, she'd looked at my dress blues with the vague confusion of someone trying to place a face from a dream. Navy, she'd said, nodding slowly, so you work on boats? Something like that, I'd replied. She'd patted my arm. Well, everyone has to start somewhere. That was the beginning, not the beginning of her condescension. That would come later, in layers, like sediment, but the beginning of her fundamental misunderstanding of who I was and what I did. To Johnny, my 30-year naval career was a placeholder, a job I'd stumbled into because I lacked the intelligence or ambition for something better. The fact that I couldn't discuss my work only confirmed her suspicions. Classified meant low level. Secret meant secretary. The less I said, the less impressive I became in her estimation. My father didn't correct her. He'd spent 40 years as a regional manager for a pharmaceutical company, a job that came with a title but not much else. When he retired, he'd discovered he had 2 things: a decent pension and a desperate need to feel important. Johnny provided that. She came from money, not vast wealth, but the kind that showed itself in heirloom furniture and garden parties and the ability to drop $500 on an orchid without checking her bank balance first. She collected things: antique teacups, first edition books, people who could enhance her social standing. My father was project number 1 in her collection of respectability. I dried my hands on a dish towel and looked out the window again. The party was in full swing. 20 guests, maybe 25, arranged in clusters on the patio and spilling onto the lawn. The women wore sundresses in pastel shades. The men had shed their jackets and rolled up their sleeves in deference to the June heat. Johnny moved among them like a hummingbird, alighting here and there, ensuring glasses stayed full and conversations stayed bright. I wasn't supposed to be here. I'd been planning to spend my leave at a rented cabin in Maine. Just me and a stack of books, and the kind of silence that didn't demand anything of me. But Dad had called 2 weeks ago with a tone that meant he wasn't really asking. Johnny's hosting her annual garden party, he'd said. She'd love it if you came. Show your support. I'm not really a garden party person, Dad. I know, sweetheart, but it would mean a lot to her, to both of us. So here I was, washing dishes in my childhood kitchen while strangers admired my stepmother's orchids. I'd arrived that morning, driven up from Norfolk in my civilian car, a 12-year-old Honda with a dent in the rear bumper that made Johnny wince every time she saw it parked in the driveway. She'd greeted me with a hug that smelled like expensive perfume and disappointment. "Daisha," she'd said, holding me at arm's length to examine my jeans and plain cotton blouse. "You didn't bring anything nicer? This is nice. For the party, I mean. Something with a little more." She gestured vaguely at herself, at her cream linen dress and pearl earrings. "I'm fine, Johnny. I'll stay inside. I've got some reading to catch up on." Relief had flickered across her face, quickly masked. "Oh well, if you're sure. The party doesn't really start until 2, so you've got time to settle in." Quote, I'd spent the morning in my old bedroom, which Johnny had redecorated into a guest room that bore no trace of my childhood. The walls were now a soft sage green instead of the blue I'd painted them myself at 16. The twin bed had been replaced with a queen, the NASA posters with generic landscape prints. Even the closet had been cleaned out, my old trophies and yearbooks relegated to boxes in the garage. It was as if I'd been gently erased, made into a guest in my own history. Around 1:30, I'd come downstairs to find the caterers setting up. Johnny had been in the kitchen arranging cheese on a wooden board, and she'd looked up with that bright, brittle smile she wore when she was about to ask for something. "Daisha, honey, would you mind helping with the dishes? Just the breakfast things. The caterers are focused on the party setup, and I want everything to look perfect." So I'd wash dishes, and then I'd dry them, and then I'd wipe down the counters and reorganize the refrigerator because Johnny kept opening it and sighing at the inefficient arrangement. By the time the first guests arrived, I'd retreated back to the kitchen with a book I wasn't reading, watching the party unfold through the window like it was a play I hadn't auditioned for. The thing about being underestimated is that it happens in increments. No single moment is dramatic enough to warrant a confrontation. It's the accumulation that kills you. The 1,000 small cuts that you're supposed to let heal individually, even as they stack up into a deeper wound. 3 months ago, Johnny had called me to discuss family finances. "Your father and I have been talking," she'd begun, her voice taking on that gentle explanatory tone people use with children and the mentally impaired. "And we're concerned about your future, retirement planning, that sort of thing." "I'm fine, Johnny. Are you?" Because from what I understand, military pensions aren't exactly generous. Especially for people who didn't make it to the higher ranks. I'd been sitting in my office at the time, with 2 stars on my collar and a view of the Pentagon courtyard. "I'll manage." "Of course you will. You're very resourceful. But your father and I have been thinking, we'd like to set up a trust for you. Just a small safety net, $20,000 to start. You could use it for a down payment on a little condo somewhere, or maybe go back to school. Get some kind of credential that might help with job placement after you. Retire." The careful pause before retire, as if she couldn't quite bring herself to imagine what I did warranting actual retirement, as if I were simply aging out of relevance. "That's generous," I'd said, "but unnecessary. Daisha, there's no shame in accepting help. Your father and I just want to make sure you're taken care of. We know the Navy doesn't pay particularly well, especially for administrative positions." I'd never told her I worked in administration. She'd invented that detail herself, filled in the gaps of my silence with her own assumptions. In Johnny's mind, I was a low-level bureaucrat pushing papers in some forgotten office, marking time until I could collect a modest pension and fade into obscurity. I'd declined the trust. She'd brought it up twice more, each time with growing concern, as if my refusal to accept her charity was evidence of pride overriding common sense. The last time she'd sighed and said, "Well, the offer stands. When you're ready to be practical about your situation, we're here." My situation. As if I were a problem to be solved rather than a person to be known. Through the window, I watched Johnny lead a small group toward the greenhouse. She walked with the confidence of someone showing off a prized possession, her hand gestures expansive and proprietary. The greenhouse was her crown jewel, a Victorian-style structure with white-painted frames and glass panes that caught the afternoon light. Inside, she kept her orchid collection, each plant labeled with its Latin name and acquisition date. She'd had the greenhouse custom-built 2 years ago, spent $30,000 on construction alone. The orchids had cost significantly more. I pulled my phone from my pocket and checked the time. 2:47 p.m. The party had been underway for 45 minutes. In 13 minutes, everything would change, though I didn't know it yet. I was simply standing in a kitchen, watching people I didn't know admire flowers I didn't care about, counting down the hours until I could reasonably excuse myself and drive back to a life that made sense. My phone buzzed. A text from my aide, Captain Candice Nesmith. "Singapore delivery confirmed. ETA your location 1500 local. Recommend you prepare the family. K." I stared at the message, my stomach dropping. "Singapore delivery. Here, in 48 minutes. I'd authorized that shipment 3 months ago, a diplomatic gift following joint naval exercises in Southeast Asia. 200 Phalaenopsis orchids, rare hybrids that couldn't be purchased commercially, sent as a gesture of goodwill from the Singaporean Minister of Defense to me personally." I'd planned to have them delivered to the botanical gardens near the Pentagon, a quiet donation that would raise no questions and require no explanation. But somewhere in the chain of coordination, someone had used my home address for my personnel file. This address, my father's house, instead of my office. I typed back, "Can you reroute?" 3 dots appeared, then disappeared. Then, negative, customs cleared this morning, truck en route. No authorized alternate location available. Sorry, Admiral. Admiral? The words sat on my phone screen like an accusation. I'd made Rear Admiral at 43, a 2-star flag officer with command responsibilities that spanned 3 carrier strike groups and a budget that exceeded most small countries' defense spending. I'd made Vice Admiral, 3 stars, at 46, after successfully coordinating a multinational maritime security operation that had prevented what could have been a catastrophic escalation in the South China Sea. The president had personally called to congratulate me. The Secretary of the Navy had written a commendation that used the word exceptional 4 times in 2 paragraphs. My father didn't know, Johnny didn't know, I'd never told them. It wasn't shame that kept me quiet, it was exhaustion. The exhaustion of knowing that if I told them, if I showed up in my service dress with 3 stars gleaming on each shoulder, they would find a way to diminish it. They would ask if I'd needed connections to advance so quickly. They would wonder aloud about diversity initiatives and lowered standards. They would congratulate me with the kind of surprise that implied I'd gotten lucky, not that I'd earned it. So I'd stayed quiet, let them think what they wanted to think. Showed up to family dinners in civilian clothes and deflected questions about my work with the practiced vagueness of someone who'd spent 3 decades keeping secrets. It had been easier that way. Cleaner. A kindness to everyone involved. But in 48 minutes, a truck would arrive with 200 orchids addressed to Vice Admiral Garvey, United States Navy, and there would be no more kindness, no more quiet. I walked outside. The patio was crowded now, clusters of guests forming and reforming like cells under a microscope. I recognized a few faces. Johnny's sister, some neighbors, a couple who owned the wine shop downtown. They nodded at me politely, the way you acknowledge someone's presence without quite seeing them. I was the stepdaughter, the one who'd done something vaguely military-related, not interesting enough to merit follow-up questions. Johnny was holding court near the greenhouse entrance, a wine glass in one hand and a pair of pruning shears in the other. She was mid-sentence when she spotted me approaching. "And this particular hybrid took 3 years to bloom," she was saying to a woman in a yellow sundress. "The patience required for proper orchid cultivation is extraordinary. Most people simply don't have the discipline." She turned to me, her smile brightening with the peculiar warmth she reserved for public displays of stepmother affection. "Daisha, come join us." I was just about to show everyone the collection. I fell into step beside her as she led the group into the greenhouse. The air inside was humid and close, thick with the smell of soil and the faint, sweet rot of organic matter. Orchids lined every shelf, their blooms ranging from pure white to deep purple, some spotted, some striped, each one arranged to maximum aesthetic effect. Price tags had been discreetly removed, but Johnny had told me once with pride that she never paid less than $200 for a plant. The really rare ones cost significantly more. "Each one costs more than most people's monthly rent," Johnny said, touching a purple bloom with one finger. The statement hung in the air, a casual flex disguised as observation. Then she turned to me, and I saw it coming, the little demonstration she'd been building toward, the moment where she could position herself as the beneficent educator and me as the grateful student of taste. "You probably think the plastic flowers at the dollar store are just as good, don't you?" Her friends tittered behind their wine glasses, a sound like wind chimes made of ice. I could have responded. I could have smiled and played along, let the moment pass like I'd let 100 other moments pass. But something in me, some accumulation of every condescending word, every knowing look, every casual dismissal of 3 decades of service, shifted and locked into place. "Actually," I said, The sound of a truck backing up cut through the afternoon, loud and unmistakable. Beep, beep, beep. Johnny's face creased with irritation. Are the caterers still making deliveries? I specifically said everything needed to be here by 2. Through the greenhouse glass, I could see a large commercial truck reversing into the driveway, its sides emblazoned with the logo of an international freight company. The back doors were already open, and 2 men in uniforms were lowering a ramp. One of the men walked toward the patio with a clipboard, scanning the crowd until his eyes landed on me. He approached with the bearing of someone delivering something official, something that mattered. "Orchid delivery," he announced. 200 plants from Singapore. The greenhouse went silent. Johnny's face drained of color. 200? From Singapore? "Yes, ma'am," addressed to Vice Admiral Garvey. He consulted his clipboard. "Says here they're a diplomatic gift from the Minister of Defense. Where would you like them?" I watched my stepmother's face cycle through confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. Behind her, the woman in the yellow sundress had stopped mid-sip, her wine glass frozen halfway to her lips. The others stared at me with expressions that ranged from shock to something approaching fear, as if I'd suddenly revealed myself to be a different species. "Vice Admiral?" Johnny whispered. The delivery man looked between us, sensing he'd stepped into something complicated. "Ma'am, I need a signature, and we need to know where to place the shipment. There's a climate-controlled greenhouse truck behind us with the plants. They need to be unloaded within the hour to maintain optimal conditions." I took the clipboard from him and signed my full name and rank. Vice Admiral Daisha M. Garvey, USN. The pen felt heavy, the signature felt heavier. "The back lawn," I said. "You can set up a temporary structure there. I'll make arrangements for permanent placement tomorrow." He nodded and walked away, speaking into a radio. Within minutes, the driveway filled with activity, 2 more trucks arriving, workers in uniforms unloading what looked like a small forest of orchids, each one carefully wrapped and labeled. The scale of the operation was unmistakable, the kind of logistical precision that only came with military or diplomatic coordination. I turned back to Johnny. Her pruning shears had fallen to the floor. "You're a vice admiral," she said. It wasn't a question. It was a statement of fact she was trying to fit into a worldview that had no space for it. "Yes." 3 stars. "Yes." "You command?" She stopped, shook her head. "What do you command?" "Currently? Combined maritime operations for the Atlantic Fleet, 15,000 personnel. 12 ships. A budget of about $3 billion. I kept my voice level, factual. This wasn't a moment for pride or anger, it was simply information, delivered too late. One of her friends, an older man with silver hair, let out a low whistle. "Good God." Johnny looked at me like she was seeing me for the first time, or maybe seeing something she'd looked past for 3 years. "The trust," she said faintly. "We tried to give you $20,000. I remember. You make—" She couldn't finish the sentence. "More than that," I said, "significantly more." The yellow sundress woman set down her wine glass with a soft clink. "You let us think." "I didn't let you think anything," I said, and now there was edge in my voice, sharp and cold. "You assumed. You decided what I was, based on what you thought I should be. I just didn't correct you." Johnny's hand went to her throat, fingers touching the pearl necklace there like a talisman. "Why didn't you tell us? Would it have mattered?" "Of course it would have." She stopped and I saw the realization hit her, that she was about to say it would have changed how she treated me, that it would have mattered not because of who I was, but because of what I'd achieved, because of the status she could have claimed by association. Behind us, the sound of workers setting up the temporary greenhouse structure filled the silence, metal poles being hammered into the ground, plastic sheeting rustling in the breeze, orders being called back and forth with military efficiency. My father appeared on the patio, drawn by the commotion. He stared at the trucks, at the workers, at me, his face a mask of confusion. "Daisha, what's going on?" "There's been a delivery," Johnny said, her voice hollow. "From Singapore, orchids, for your daughter, the Vice Admiral." Dad looked at me. "Vice Admiral?" "Yes, Dad." He opened his mouth, closed it, opened it again. "Since when?" 4 years ago, 3 stars. Made it a year after Mom died. Something flickered in his eyes. Hurt, maybe, or shame. You didn't tell me. I didn't tell anyone. But why? I looked at Johnny, at her friends, at the greenhouse full of orchids that she'd used as social currency, as proof of her taste and wealth and superiority. Because I was tired, I said. Tired of being underestimated. Tired of being corrected and pitied and helped. Tired of watching people decide who I was before asking. So I stopped asking them to see me. I just let them look past me instead. One of the workers approached with a tablet. Admiral, we have a question about the climate control settings. Can you confirm the temperature specifications? I excused myself and walked toward the truck, leaving the greenhouse behind. The next 20 minutes were consumed with logistics, signing forms, verifying plant manifests, coordinating with the delivery team to ensure proper setup. It was familiar work, comfortable. I knew how to command, I knew how to delegate, I knew how to make decisions that moved mountains of equipment and personnel across continents. What I didn't know was how to go back inside that greenhouse and face the people who'd just watched their entire understanding of me shatter. By the time I finished, the party had dissolved. Guests were making quiet excuses, slipping away to their cars with backward glances and whispered conversations. Johnny stood alone on the patio, her arms wrapped around herself despite the warmth of the afternoon. My father sat on a wrought iron chair nearby, his face slack with something I couldn't name. I walked over to them. The temporary greenhouse structure behind me stood complete, a professional installation that would maintain optimal conditions for 200 orchids, worth more than Johnny's entire collection combined. I should go, I said. Stay, Dad's voice cracked. Please, we need to talk about this. There's nothing to talk about. Everything to talk about, Johnny said softly. Daisha, She stopped, and I saw tears in her eyes. I'm so sorry. The apology surprised me. Not because it was insincere, but because it was. She meant it. And somehow that made it worse, the knowledge that she was sorry not for who she'd been to me, but for who she'd failed to recognize. I know, I said. Can we start over? She asked. Can I try to know you? The real you? I looked at her orchids through the greenhouse glass, at the purple bloom she'd touched with such pride. I don't think that's possible. Why not? Because you don't want to know me, Johnny. You want to know Vice Admiral Garvey. You want to know the person who commands fleets and receives diplomatic gifts. That's not the same thing. She flinched. Dad stood, took a step toward me. Sweetheart, I'm your father. I should have known. I should have asked. Yeah, I said. You should have. The silence stretched between us, filled with 3 years of missed opportunities and willful blindness. I thought about telling them everything. About the missions I couldn't discuss, the weight of command, the nights I'd stared at the ceiling of some foreign port wondering if the decisions I'd made that day would get people killed. I thought about explaining that rank wasn't what defined me, that the stars on my shoulder were just metal and thread, that I was still the same person who'd washed dishes in their kitchen that morning. But I was tired, so tired. I'm going to pack my things, I said. Neither of them stopped me. I went upstairs to the guest room that used to be mine, packed my duffel with the few items I'd brought. Through the window I could see the temporary greenhouse on the back lawn, the workers finishing the last details of installation. In 3 hours they'd be gone. In 3 days, a botanical garden in D.C. would take possession of the orchids. In 3 weeks, this day would become a story Johnny told at dinner parties, the time she'd unknowingly insulted a vice admiral, and the humiliation would transform into a kind of exotic anecdote, proof that she'd been humbled by someone truly impressive. But the relationship we might have had, the one built on curiosity instead of assumption, on respect instead of tolerance, that was gone. You can't start over once you've shown someone how little they truly saw you. I carried my bag downstairs. Dad was waiting by the front door. Don't leave like this, he said. How should I leave? I don't know, but not angry. I'm not angry, Dad, and I wasn't. Anger required energy I didn't have. What I felt was something closer to grief, for the version of this family that could have existed if anyone had cared enough to ask the right questions. I'm just tired. He nodded, understanding or accepting that he didn't understand. Will you come back? For Thanksgiving, maybe? Maybe. He pulled me into a hug and I let him, feeling the tremor in his arms. "I love you," he said. "I'm proud of you. I should have said that more." "Yeah," I said into his shoulder. "You should have." When I pulled away, Johnny was standing in the doorway to the kitchen. She looked small, diminished, her expensive linen dress suddenly just fabric, her pearl earrings just stones. "I really am sorry," she said again. "I know. It doesn't fix anything, does it?" "No, it doesn't." I picked up my duffel and walked to my car. As I backed out of the driveway, I saw them standing together on the porch, Dad with his arm around Johnny's shoulders, both of them watching me leave. Behind them, through the living room window, I could see the edge of the greenhouse structure, a monument to everything left unsaid. I drove back to Norfolk with the windows down and the radio off, letting the wind noise fill the silence. My phone buzzed occasionally, texts from Nesmith confirming the Orchid situation was handled, a message from my chief of staff about a meeting Monday morning, a notification about an intelligence briefing that needed my review. I was Vice Admiral Garvey. I commanded thousands of sailors. I coordinated operations that shaped international relations. I held security clearances that granted me access to information that could topple governments. And for 3 years, my own family had thought I worked in administration. The irony would have been funny if it didn't hurt so much.